Hi, and welcome to Capturing Christianity. My name is Cameron Bertuzzi. I'm exposing you to the intellectual side of Christian belief. And today I'm talking with Dr. Sy Garte. He's a biochemist who was an atheist for most of his life, and now he's a Christian. And so today on the program, we're talking about his transition from being an atheist to a Christian, which happened relatively recently, and all the reasons that led up to that point. And so over time, basically what his story is that over time, more and more cracks, more and more things that he found, these reasons to doubt his atheist, materialist worldview. And so we're going to cover some of those reasons today. Well, let's go ahead and just jump right into it. So Sy, welcome to the show. Should I call you Dr. Garte? Dr. Sy, how should I address you?
Just Sy is fine.
Just Sy. Well, thanks for coming on the program. I understand that you're a longtime watcher of Capturing Christianity.
Yes, I've been admiring your show for quite a while.
Well, I'm really happy that you were able to make it on to learn a little bit more about who Dr. Sy is. He, like I mentioned, is a biochemist, or he's a retired biochemist. He had his PhD in biochemistry. He's been a tenured professor at New York University, Rutgers University, and the University of Pittsburgh. He's currently visiting professor of pharmacology and toxicology at Rutgers. He has published more than 200 peer-reviewed scientific papers, and he's published 4 books. And I think lots of atheists wish they were half as cool as you, Sy.
I doubt it.
Well, thanks for coming on to the show. It's great to have you here.
It's great to be here.
So if you're interested in apologetics, make sure to subscribe to my channel. You want to learn more about apologetics, subscribe, but then also turn on the little bell. It's like subscribing is not necessarily the thing that you need to do nowadays. You need to turn on the bell so you can get notifications and come watch the videos, basically. So if you're interested, subscribe, but then also turn on the bell. All right, let's jump right into it. So tell me about your upbringing, because this was something really interesting that I found, was that you say that you were raised in a communist family. Mm-hmm. So what was it about communism or why was atheism sort of accompanied by communism?
Oh, that's an interesting question. So the Communist Party throughout the world, and my parents were members of the American Communist Party in the 30s and in the 40s, part of the communist ideology was a very strong acceptance of atheism, or I should say a very strong hostility towards organized religion. Remember, Marx was pretty unkind to religion as the opium of the masses, etc. And communist regimes in Russia, China, and North Korea, everywhere, have come down pretty hard on Christianity and any other religion that they find competes with their own views. So I was raised in a household that accepted communism, but also was not only what I call the weak atheism, which is that, you just don't believe in God. They were much stronger than that. They felt that God was impossible and evil, and that Christianity was an evil force in history. And so that was the attitude I grew up with, and which I accepted, as people tend to do, right? I always find it amusing on Twitter when somebody says, "Oh, you're only a Christian because you were brought up that way," and I just laugh at 10 minutes when I see those. No, I was not brought up as a Christian. So quite the opposite. So that was my original, and I sometimes even call it a faith, because communists do have certain characteristics in their ideology that are sort of faith-based, and it's not really a faith, but it's analogous. So that's how I grew up. And along with that philosophical view, or the political view, was a philosophical view that embraced pure materialism. And that, again, was part of the very anti-theistic, anti-spiritual, even anti-psychology view of most communists. And that is that anything that's real is approachable by science, by the scientific method. Everything else is not real or not worth thinking about. And materialism was the philosophy of that group of people, and I absorbed that as well. And so my view, when I started learning about science, was that everything in the world can be ascribed to purely materialistic causes, and physics, biology, chemistry was the way to learn those things.
So how recently did you become a Christian? Because it's not, I mean, You've been doing this for a little while now, and it's only
Yeah.
recently that you transitioned to becoming a Christian. So how recent was this?
Well, it was a long, slow process, which I described to some degree in my book. But what really, I guess I started thinking about theism in my 40s, and that was the result of what I can talk about is my disillusionment with atheism and with materialism. But Christianity took longer, and it's been about, I would say, roughly between 12 and 15 years that I began identifying myself as a Christian. It took a little longer for me to actually go further and get baptized and join a church. That happened about 7 years ago. So I was in my 60s when that happened.
I understand that you're part of a Methodist church.
Yes, I'm actually the lay leader of my church, the United Methodist Church. It's still the United Methodist Church. We'll see what happens.
So what is it? What is it that led you to a Methodist church?
I found a parking space.
Fair enough.
I was looking for a church. I decided it was time to join a church. I knew almost nothing about Protestant churches. I knew a little bit about Catholicism. I grew up in Brooklyn. Christianity was Catholicism in Brooklyn, and I'd never met a Protestant until I was, I think, in college in New York. So I didn't know much. I was looking at everything. I went to a Presbyterian church. I couldn't find a parking space, so I drove away. And then I went to this Methodist church. I parked. I went in. I heard a great sermon. And I went over to the pastor, or actually she came to me and asked if there was anything she could do for me. And I said, well, I'm thinking about maybe getting baptized. I told her a little bit about my story. And she said, okay, we'll do it next week. So that's it.
That's that. Well, if you guys want to learn more about Sy, I've linked a lot of his stuff in the description of this video. So you have you just started a YouTube channel called, what is it, Faithful Science, but Syence. But
Right.
it's linked in the description of the video, so you can find it really easily. I have his Twitter linked there, which you're very active on Twitter, and you interact with atheists all the time. And then the last thing is your book, which we'll talk a little about today, which documents basically your journey from atheism to Christianity.
Right.
So one of the things that stuck out to me in your book as I was reading it was you say, I mean, you were like a real atheist. You weren't like this. I don't know. If people think, because sometimes people say you weren't a real Christian for people who are Christian and then go to atheist. You were a real atheist. You list some of the things that you believed as you grew up. You believed that there was no evidence for God. You believed that religion had been an evil force in history.
Correct.
You believed that the belief in God was irrational, not provable, not falsifiable, and was only based on unreliable subjective experience. You thought that Jesus' resurrection was magical and impossible. And these are all things that I've heard from atheists myself. But I wanted to focus on one of these, if we can just pinpoint, shed some light on one of these areas, because you say that later on in the book, you changed your mind on all of these, all of these beliefs that you grew up with or started out with. So let's look at that one, because I haven't heard you in another interview talk about this. You believed that religion had always been a force for evil. So what evidence convinced you otherwise?
Well, like everyone else growing up in this culture, and I see it all the time now in atheist tweets and memes, I believed in the idea that Christianity was opposed to science forever, opposed to human progress, and was a force mostly for the benefit of the ruling class and, kings, the divine right of kings and all that, and was a regressive force. And I don't know if it's being taught that way now. It was starting to get taught that way when I was young. And it turns out that, when you read a little bit of history, and I happen to be a real history buff. In fact, at one point I thought I would major in history instead of science. I just didn't know how I would make a living at it. So I changed to science, but I love history. And all of that is mythological. It turns out that if you look into it in any depth, and one of my videos on my channel that you mentioned is about this. If you look into any depth in history of religion and science, you find out that all the early scientists, all of them, were Christians or theists of some sort. And what they thought they were doing, and this was clearly articulated by people like Newton and Bacon and many others, they thought that they were, and correctly, that they were exploring the creation. How does God's creation work? I mean, it's a principle of Christianity that we live in a lawful universe, a universe that is orderly. And so what are those laws? And that's what they discovered. And that went on for centuries, up until the present day. And there's, the whole idea that science and religion are enemies and opposites. And the whole Galileo affair was totally misrepresented in history books and continues to be misrepresented, for example, on the Cosmos show with Sagan and later with Tyson. The historical realities are not what we think they are. And I discovered that after reading about this and finding that actually there is no historical evidence that Christianity was holding back scientific progress. It's a nice meme. People love to say it. Some of the new atheists made it a major part of their arguments. It's just false. You just have to look at the history to see that.
So on the topic of things that sort of took you away from atheism, it started to produce cracks in your atheistic worldview. And one of the first things you mentioned is your own science, your own field, how things that you discovered in science started to sort of chip away at your atheistic materialism. One of the things that was interesting in an interview you pointed out, or that you did with Inspiring Philosophy, and he's a big quantum physics guy, is quantum physics itself was one of the reasons why you started to doubt your atheism. So tell me more about that. Was this your first oh no moment?
Yeah, I think it was. I was in college. I was actually a chemistry major, but when you learn chemistry, one of the things you have to do is solve the Schrodinger equation, which is the wave equation. And you do that very mechanically. You don't really think about what it all means. But if you do go into it in some depth and look at what the wave equation is, and you start learning about this, the split slot experiment where electrons go through one or the other slot, and they are neither a wave or a particle, and that's what the whole Schrodinger equation is about. And then when you go further, which I did, and I started reading about other parts of quantum mechanics, like the observer effect, which is related to the split slot experiment. That tells you that you can't really tell what the state of an electron is unless you look at it, until you look at it. When you look at it, the actual state of the electron collapses to a wave equation. But before that, it's indeterminate. And then there's the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, which is really interesting, because that is a scientific fact which everything depends on, including our having this discussion online. I mean, quantum mechanics is absolutely true, otherwise most modern technology wouldn't work. And what the Heisenberg uncertainty principle says is you cannot, it is physically impossible, and it's not just that we don't know, it's just known to be impossible to know the position and the momentum of an electron or other particle at the same time. And, this is a scientific law that tells you what we cannot know, which is, I think, maybe the first one like that. There are now others. And that really struck me as, well, how does that make sense? How could that be in a materialistic universe where there are things that we can't know? If we could actually pin down precisely the speed of an electron, then we have no idea where it is. And if we can pin down exactly where it is, we can't tell anything about its speed. This is the basis of radioactivity. So it's a true thing, but it didn't fit with my materialistic view, which was based on things like, F equals ma, very simple, clear equations where natural phenomena can be understood and calculated. There are things you can't calculate. And the thing about quantum mechanics, in the very beginning, when the quantum theory was first postulated by Max Planck, what it says is that the whole idea that if you want to go from point A to point B, you have to pass everything in between, right? If you heat water from being very cold to being very hot, it goes through all the temperatures in between cold and hot.
Mm-hmm.
That's not true for the electrons in an atom in terms of their energy state. They can go from one energy state to another energy state without passing through the ones in between. That was the original idea of the quantum. So that makes no sense. What I found
so when
out,
you say it, so if I can just jump in real quick. So when you say it doesn't make sense, or when you in the book you use the term irrational,
right?
I think, and correct me if I'm wrong here, because I'm a philosophy guy, and these terms I think are really important that we get clear on like what we mean by rational or irrational. I think what you're trying to say is that these are very unexpected things that we found in science.
Correct, and they're
based on our
technically
experience
not irrational because they do have mathematical formulations and mathematical meanings, which are rational in terms of math. But in terms of human common sense, they're impossible to understand.
And this is what kind of opened you up to start thinking, well, hey, maybe there is, when it comes to miracles or supernatural, these things are really unexpected, I guess, on my own view. But if there are things in science, things that are, quantum mechanics, quantum superposition, and all these other things, these are things that are very unexpected to us.
Right.
And so why should, I should be sort of open to whatever the evidence suggests instead of just sort of being dogmatically opposed to everything that just doesn't fit squarely nicely into my existing worldview.
Exactly. And you mentioned miracles. So the example I like to use is suppose it was, in the 1880s, and I said to you, there's a particle that is at the other end of the universe. And because it flipped its rotation, there's a particle right here on Earth that also flipped its rotation. You would say.
At the same time.
At the same time. And we're talking, forget about the speed of light. I mean, it's no connection. It's way, way beyond the speed of light. Mm-hmm. And you would say, that's impossible. Well, it's not impossible. It's true. So once you accept that, how do you say that any miracle, quote unquote, is impossible? Okay. Now, I don't hold that view theologically now. I hold the view that miracles are miracles and they're created by God. But at that time, my view was exactly what you said. If all these crazy things are real, and they are, and nobody understands them, and they don't, then why do we rule out anything like a resurrection or, water turning into wine? I mean, it put a big crimp in my materialism belief. In fact, it was a big shock. It didn't make me a theist, but yeah.
But quantum mechanics was the number one thing that started to get you thinking. That was the first,
right.
So what was another oh no moment? Because in the book, one of the things that was really interesting to me was your discussion on fractals. That was actually the first time I've ever heard of fractals.
Yeah.
So tell me more about that.
Well, fractals are fascinating. That came a bit later, but the whole idea of a fractal is that certain things, and the best example is still the idea of a coastline, a rugged coastline like Great Britain or Maine, or any coastline which is very, very rugged, has a lot of bays and valleys, and not valleys, bays and inlets and, features, okay? And you see that if you're in a plane at 50,000 feet, you look down at the coast and you'll see it's not smooth, it goes in all different directions. If you go down to 1,000 feet, you'll see the same thing. You'll see more detail, but it's still very rugged. If you're actually standing on the shore, looking down at your feet, you see the same thing, only at a very small scale. But it's the same degree of ruggedness. This is what's called self-similarity independent of scale. And it turns out that the same thing is true of leaves, of lungs, of all sorts of biological and geological features. In other words, we cannot describe a coastline or the geometry of a lung or the geometry of a leaf with a simple geometric equation, or we can't use the dimension. We don't say it's one-dimensional. It's not a one-dimensional line. It's not a two-dimensional shape. It's somewhere in between. It's a fractional dimension, and that's what a fractal is. And it turns out almost everything is fractal in nature. Just think of self-similarity, and one of the examples I like to use is history. If we look at the history of last year, we can find thousands and thousands of stories that we talk about. If we look at the history of the last 1,000 years, we can also find thousands and thousands of stories. And as we get smaller and smaller, the number of stories, doesn't get smaller. In fact, it increases. So there's a self-similarity in scale in many, many things. I happen to be one of the first people to publish a paper on the self-similarity in DNA and as a fractal. But it's not the only thing. There are many things in biology that are fractal. Now, what did that do for me? Well, it showed me that our reality, again, is not simple and smooth. There's complexity everywhere. And it made me wonder, what is it about this universe, about our world, about everything we know, that makes it so complex and makes it self-similar or scale independent, makes it simply beyond a simple grasp? The whole idea of materialism is that eventually we'll understand everything. There'll be a few equations that will explain everything. And I began to realize, no, that's never going to happen.
So there were several things that happened along the way, but what was it that actually made you transition from someone who's open to Christianity to someone who's accepted Jesus? What was it that actually caused that to happen?
Yeah, that was also a little bit of a long journey, but shorter. I had, during this whole period when I was sort of an agnostic, when I had rejected atheism, I had rejected materialism, and I was kind of open to the whole idea of theism, I began reading a lot. I began searching, basically. I felt that I was missing something. I felt I was missing a large part of real life and I had always missed it. I had never been taught it. So I began reading various things. Some of them, I looked into various religions. I got, obviously, because of my generation, I looked into New Age and Buddhism, all the things that were popular in the 60s. And I rejected all of those, and they just didn't convince me. But I kept reading things, and I began feeling that spirituality was real, and there was something to it, and it needed a little more study. And eventually, one of the things I read was parts of the Bible. I wasn't terribly interested in the Old Testament. I have to say that I read it now, but there are parts of it that I don't like. I'm not really much of a theologian or an apologist, so it's hard for me to defend certain parts of the Bible. But when I read the New Testament, I had an amazing epiphany, because I read the Gospel according to Matthew first, and I'd actually seen a film about the Gospel according to Matthew when I was a teenager, and I found that very moving. I dismissed it immediately, but I found it moving at the time. And when I read it carefully, it did not strike me as something that was made up. It didn't strike me as fake or propaganda or whatever I had been taught. And the same thing with the Book of Acts. I felt that really read like history to me. It didn't read like, somebody decided, well, let's write something to convince the suckers to join in. And then a friend brought me to a church. It happened to be a Catholic church. I was terrified, but I went, and it was the first time I'd ever been in any kind of a church in my life, and I was in my late 40s by then. And the experience was fine. Nothing bad happened. I thought I'd be stoned, but it was actually quite pleasant. And so all of that made me think harder about the idea of maybe Christianity was interesting. I had rejected some alternatives already related to religion. But what really got me over the edge was a direct experience with the Holy Spirit. And that came in the form of some dreams. These are I don't think we have time to go through them, but they're explained in great detail in my book in one chapter. And they helped me move, but it was very hard for me to get over that threshold of faith. I just, every time I thought about it, I pulled back and said, no, I can't do this. I'm a scientist. I'm rational. I can't believe in magic or superstition. It's just too much to ask. And eventually, as I put it, God took mercy on me and literally pulled me over the edge. And that happened, again, in an experience that's explained in great detail in the book, and that happened while I was driving. People ask me if I had a road to Damascus, and I tell them no, it was a road to Pittsburgh. I was driving on the Pennsylvania Turnpike, and something happened. I heard a preacher on a Christian radio station. I started thinking what it would be like if I preached a sermon, and because I love to talk, as may be obvious, and I wondered what I would say, and I started preaching a sermon, and it wasn't me preaching it. It was not what I would have thought I would have said. I didn't know where the words came from. I preached it to myself. I imagined having an audience in front of me, and by the time it was over, which is about 10 minutes, I pulled the car over, luckily, and I realized that I'd been touched by the Spirit, and I was a Christian. I never went back after that.
So tell me about after you transition, okay? Because I think a lot of people have this idea of the science, the academy, everything as being very anti-religious,
Yes.
anti-Christian. And so tell me what that was like for you after you transitioned to becoming a Christian. Did you keep that a secret? Did you want to tell anyone?
I kept it a secret.
Like?
I did. I kept it a secret because I didn't know any of the Christians, actually, and I knew maybe one or two, but I knew none in the scientific community that I knew. I thought I was the only one. And when that incident was that I just explained in the car was over, the first thing I thought to myself is, what do I do now? I have to, quit. I have to stop being a scientist. I have to reject evolution. I had no idea. And for a long time, for several years, I kept it quiet. I didn't tell anybody. I thought about it a lot. I prayed a lot. Occasionally, I would go to a church. And then I discovered that I was wrong. I read a book by Francis Collins, the director of the NIH, probably the best book of the century, as far as I'm concerned, called The Language of God. And this is a beautiful book about his faith. And he is one of the top scientists in the world today in my field. He's a geneticist and brilliant guy. And reading that book showed me that I wasn't an aberration. It was what I was doing was not impossible. And since then, I've met hundreds of other scientists of Christian faith. There's organizations. I'll plug the American Scientific Affiliation, ASA, which is asa3.org, which is a group of about 3,000 scientists, all of whom are Christians, in the U.S. and Canada.
For any scientists that are watching this and are concerned about coming out as a Christian, what advice do you have for them? If you could talk to them for just a moment.
Well, it depends. I mean, I was never persecuted, but then again, I never told certain people that I was Christian. There are places and departments and individual scientists who are extremely anti-Christianity. I've heard occasionally rumors of somebody who did lose a job or didn't get tenure or didn't get promoted or whatever, but those cases are not easily confirmed. I don't know how frequent it is, but I would recommend a certain degree of caution, and at least within your workplace. But I would also recommend joining an organization like the ASA or which doesn't have any particular theological view. So if whether you're evolutionary creationist like me or young Earth creationist, everybody's welcome. Then there are some organizations which are specific to very specific theological views. Hugh Ross runs a Reason to Believe. He's a great guy. He and Fuzz Rana, they have a slightly different take on creation, for example. But again, they're very good scientists, Christians. If you really hold to literal Bible, join a literal interpretation of Genesis. There are a few young Earth creationists who are scientists. I just had an interesting discussion with Paul Oja about some of those. But they are, they're scientists. So whatever your theological viewpoint is, there's a place for you, and there's an organization for you. There's also Biologos, I should mention, which is pretty much a strong evolutionary creationist group of scientists. So there are many, and don't feel isolated. Now, you may be isolated in your department, but you may not be, because when I did finally come out as a Christian, at that point I was working at NIH at the government, and I came out in my farewell speech when I retired, and people asked me, "What are you going to do?" So I said, "Well, I'm going to write a book. I'm going to work at my church, and I'm going to work to help reconcile Christianity to science." And you could have heard a pin drop. I mean, mouths dropped open. But after that, 5 or 6 people came up to me and said, "Thank you. I'm also a Christian, and I didn't know you were." And
Wow.
Yeah. So
if you could go, I was just going to ask you a question. If you could go
Sure.
back in time and talk to your own self about 20, 30 years ago, what advice would you give earlier Sy?
That's a very tough question. I've had a very stormy life, so I would have given myself a lot of advice. In terms of religion, I probably would have told myself to do what I did, but do it earlier.
So read some books on quantum mechanics.
Yeah,
basically.
well, read some books from. I mean, there were other people writing books about science and Christianity before Francis Collins, and I didn't know them. They were not as popular, but now that I know them, I would tell them to read some of those and just think more. It's very hard to talk to your younger self.
Yeah.
As you'll
I
find
put
out
you on the spot there.
Older.
Well, so as I was preparing for this interview, I was watching some of your debates online, and one of the ones that I watched was your debate with R.N. Ra, and that was the recent one on modern day debate. And what I noticed was that you and him, you were very, very cordial. And maybe is that because you kind of have like similar, I don't know if backgrounds is the right way to put it. What is it? Why do you think that you're so on the sort of, it almost looked like you guys were on the same wavelength?
Well, we sort of are, because that was the second time we interacted publicly. The first time was I had just started doing anything online, and he heard about me, I don't know how, and he invited me on his channel. He didn't know anything about me, and we had a very interesting and eventually cordial conversation then, because he was under the assumption that all Christians were young Earth creationists. And when I explained to him that I fully uphold evolution, he was surprised. I mean, he hadn't really been exposed to too many others. Now that's changed more recently. He had a very interesting discussion with Mike Jones, and he's talked to others. But at that point, he was sort of taken aback and happy about that. And we talked about a lot of things. I actually have a clip of that discussion on a video that I'm almost about to upload, where this video is a compilation of clips from discussions I've had online with 4 different atheists. One of them is Aaron. And so by the time we met again on Modern Day Debate, and we were talking about the nature of evidence, we already knew each other. And the other thing that's important is we had been on Non Sequitur shows several times together, facing a common opponent, who was either, well, one of them, I don't want to mention his name because he's not somebody worth mentioning, but there was one really horrendous individual who called himself Christian, and then there was the more common folks, like Kent Hovind and some other people who are not that bad. They just don't agree with evolution, and Aaron and I were on the same side at that point. So he and I've also paid him a lot of respect for his knowledge of phylogenetics, which is really remarkable. He really knows his biology much more than I do when it comes to that kind of evolutionary biology. So yeah, I think we've been friendly. He's a very strong atheist, and he will occasionally say things that really get me upset. And I tell him that. But I mean, I don't consider myself to be an apologist the way you are, Cameron, but I do feel that as Christians, we have at least the responsibility to talk to people, even if we don't necessarily have the arguments to persuade them. And I know I don't. I just simply don't know enough theology to do that.
That's actually a nice segue into my last question that I have for you. But before we get to that, I just want to make a quick announcement. So we are funded. Is completely Capturing Christianity is funded through you. So if you'd like to help support this ministry, head over to patreon.com/capturingchristianity. But I wanted to let you guys know that we are starting a Spanish YouTube channel. And I don't speak Spanish yet. I'm actually working on it. But that's something that we are currently working on. So if you'd like to support this ministry, head over to patreon.com/capturingchristianity. That's where your funds are going right now. My plan is to hire someone full-time to basically transcribe our videos. The first video that we're working on is the interview with Dr. Gary Habermas. So we're working on that right now, in fact, and it basically just requires money. I want to hire this person full-time to come on staff to Capturing Christianity and to basically just churn out videos in Spanish constantly. So if you want to be part of that, head over, like I said, patreon.com/capturingchristianity. So we're about to head over to live Q&A. Let me give some details on that real quick, and then I'm going to ask Sy one last question, and then we'll get to your questions that you have for Sy. But here are some of the ground rules. Ask your questions in the live chat. You can start doing that right now. One question per person. Make sure to tag at Capturing Christianity so I can see your questions. Don't forget that, because there's a lot of comments, a lot of things. So make sure to tag me. It's a lot easier to see. Make sure that your question is on topic. We're talking about Sy's transition from atheism to Christianity. Try to make them as on topic as possible. Otherwise, they probably won't make it in. And lastly, super chat questions are going to be bumped to the top. So with that being said, here's my last question for you, Sy, and then I'm going to let you go, and we're going to start to filter in some questions here from the audience. So last question is, as a scientist, do you find philosophy difficult, challenging? Do you like it? Do you dislike it? What are your thoughts?
Well, I think I love philosophy as a general principle. I think philosophy is critical to human culture, to human endeavor. And I think that one of the shames about some modern scientists is that they seem to scorn philosophy. And without philosophy, you don't know what your science actually means. My problem is that I find it hard to read and understand philosophy because I'm not trained in it. And so when I read it, I probably have the same reaction that a lot of people have when they read molecular biology. I have to read several things several times before I really grasp what's being said. So one exception is logic. I was fortunate enough to study symbolic logic in college a bit. So I love logic as a tool for some things. I'm also aware that logic is not equivalent to science. That's a very important point I might just make. The modern scientific method uses logic, but it is not logic. It is experimental observation, which is a very different thing. And I think everybody knows this whole principle of induction, etc. So,
what's been your favorite philosophy book that you've read?
Well, I'm blanking right now.
What's your favorite philosophical thought to think about?
Well, at this point, I think the meaning. I wouldn't say the philosophy of science, because the philosophy of science is a very weird field that isn't really the philosophy of science. It's about things, but I like the idea of philosophical discussions of scientific findings. And I mean, many scientists are very good philosophers. Albert Einstein was one of the best, and there are some others who, who have been doing a great job. More recently, there's a modern philosopher. There's a couple coming to my mind now. One is the vice president of Biologos. His name is James Stump, and he has some great philosophical discussions about how science, especially evolution, merges with Christianity. So these are all Christians. I mean, I'm mostly reading Christian philosophy. One exception is Daniel Dennett, who I think actually has some very interesting philosophical ideas. Difficult, but very interesting, and somebody I would recommend. Some of them I completely disagree with. I totally disagree.
I'm not a huge Dennett fan.
No,
to be honest,
I disagree with obviously with his atheism and also his views on consciousness. But some of his other stuff is actually quite good. I mean, he talks about teleology in biology as real, and that's a great. I believe that's a great call. I mean, I published a paper on teleology and evolution, and I think, and Dennett has said that atheists should stop saying there's no such thing as teleology in biology, because it's obviously fake. It's obviously untrue. And so I admire him for that. And so that's...
All right, let's get to...
that's enough, yeah.
Yeah, let's get to the questions here. We have one from Sage. He says, what are some of the major obstacles in origins of life research?
Oh, wow. Okay, that's something I know quite a bit about, because I'm actually working in it and collaborating with a couple of people. So there's some major obstacles. One of them
before you get into that, actually, let me just make a note to everybody that I already have so many questions lined up, so I can't take any more. Yeah,
I'll keep
people
it short.
Have been just. Well, no. What I was going to say to people watching live is don't send any more questions in the live chat. We're already sort of at our capacity. So if we reach that point where we're able to get through all of them, that's fine. But otherwise, send them in via super chats. I think that's the only way that we're going to be able to bump them up to the top. Because otherwise, I just have so many questions here. So sorry to cut you off, but yeah, go.
No, that's
ahead.
all right. Just try to make it brief. We do have a good hypothesis of RNA world, but the problem is, there's a lot of technical difficulties with RNA world, which has to do with RNA self-replication. And we don't know how we got to RNA world, and we also don't know how we can get from RNA world to modern DNA protein world. And those are really large obstacles. There are people working on it, some very good people. And as I said, I'm working with somebody else on that. And another one is the whole issue of fidelity of replication. We have to find a way that we can explain how life was able to replicate itself well, in other words, accurately, because inaccurate replication does not allow for evolution. But I can, that's a huge topic. That's probably going to be the subject of the video for sure.
Great. All right. Next question is from Anthony Rowden. He says, hey, Sy, what do you find is the biggest impediment to faith in the scientific community? Good question.
It's a very good question. I think my own view is that the biggest impediment is cultural prejudice that people have grown up with since childhood. I mean, they've been told, and even more recently been told even more strongly, that science and faith are incompatible, they're enemies, they're in conflict, you choose one or the other. And the reason that I wrote my book, and this is what I told the publisher, is to disabuse young students or even older people that you have to choose between science and Christian faith. If you were brought up in a Christian home, and then you go to school and you learn that evolution is true and cosmology is true and science is true, that should do nothing to disrupt your Christian faith. If anything, it should strengthen it. So, that's my main message to the world, actually.
All right, next question is from Brando. He says, is there anything scientific that could change your belief in Christianity? Anything scientific that can change your belief in Christianity?
I would say no. And the reason for that is that I see science as part of the world view that includes my Christian faith. In other words, I can't imagine a scientific discovery that would say, oh, well, there's no God. That seems impossible to me. And the other cultural issue that's a big problem, and I get this from atheists on Twitter all the time, is the idea that, well, we can explain everything, and every time we explain something, God gets less and less important, and that's simply wrong. It's not that God did this or did that. God did everything. God created the universe. And so everything that's in the universe is a God creation. So the fact that we can now explain what thunder is and what germs are, that doesn't detract anything from God. These are all parts of God's creation.
On the topic of germs, are you familiar with everything that's happening with the coronavirus right now? Yes. If you're watching this in the future, this is happening right now. Like, right. Everyone's blowing it up. I don't want to say it's being blown out of proportion, but what are your thoughts on that as a biochemist?
Well, I've also done some epidemiology in my time, or worked with epidemiologists, so I know a little bit about it. Not a lot, but a little. Enough to know that we're really at the early stages. This could be a pandemic, but I see a few positive signs just today that it may. In the future, I may sound like a complete idiot having said anything, but it's possible that because of the decrease in the rate of spread in South Korea and even in this country, it doesn't look like a typical really out of control pandemic at this moment. Now that could change because it's so early and we don't have enough testing going on. So the best advice is to do everything. In other words, don't go on a cruise ship. Follow the CDC advice. Don't fly unless you have to. Don't be in large crowds and large gatherings for at least another week until we see what really is going on. But I think that the quarantines that have gone on and some other things may have already had a positive effect. And it's possible that this will actually turn out not to be the worst case scenario. It's also possible that it will. So it's just too early to say.
Gotcha.
Sorry.
All right. Well, let's not. No worries.
let's not dwell on that. Yeah. Okay.
Not too much time because it's a little off topic.
Right.
Jesus. This is another question from epistemology. Jesus mentions Adam and Eve. Do you believe that they were real people? Do you believe the literal account of original sin?
Okay, that's fascinating. I'm in the middle of reading a book which I'm going to be reviewing called The Genealogical Adam and Eve by a friend of mine, a scientist named Joshua Swamida.
He was on the show.
He's on your show. Okay.
Yeah, he was on the show with Michael of Inspiring Philosophy.
Yes, that's right. I remember seeing that. So watch that show. That's what I agree with.
Okay, cool. I'm sorry. It's taking a second for me to get this.
Yeah.
This next question populated here. I've got to do all of this on my own right now, but we're almost there. 1 second. Downtime is the worst time in. Do you want to call this radio? Whatever you want to call it. Here's the next question. SoCal Mike, has Dr. Garte watched the Hoover Institute video about the mathematical problems with evolution? If so, what are his thoughts?
I have not, and I don't know what those mathematical problems could be, but I know the mathematical theory of evolution, and it seems fine, so I don't know what. I hope we're not talking about the odds of getting a protein, because that's just not true. That's incorrect. So wrong.
Why do you think that's incorrect?
Well, because, the odds of getting a specific protein are 1 in whatever, 10 to the, large number. But that's not how evolution works. First of all, it's not one protein that does a thing. There are thousands and millions of potential proteins that can do the same thing. And second of all, evolution does it. What often happens here is that people start mixing evolution with abiogenesis. And so the mathematical odds of abiogenesis are very, very poor. And I am someone who is still on the fence about abiogenesis. I think it's just as likely that it was a miracle, it was a special creation of God, than it was a natural evolution from previous chemistry. But I don't know. I don't know the answer.
All right, fair enough. Here's the next question from Michael, it looks like. Where would you start a conversation about the theory of evolution with Christians that are strongly against it?
That's a great question, and the answer is the first thing to do is find out what they think evolution is, and then explain to them what it really is, because that is the key problem. Many people think that evolution is a theory that one animal, a cat turns into a dog or whatever, and that's not what evolution says. Evolution actually requires that a cat can never turn into a dog, or that one animal can never turn into another animal. So the first thing to do is make sure they understand what the theory of evolution actually says. I don't know if you want to even go much beyond that, because, you can start talking about pseudogenes and fossils and transitional forms, but usually that's not the main thing for people. And main thing for people is us, human beings. And in that case, I would again suggest you watch the video with Swamidas about an alternative explanation for how humans arose, and it does not deny evolution.
All right, here's the next question. This one is from Roger Sherman II. He says, what do atheists believe the meaning of life is?
Right. So I can answer what I believed, and that was something that I'm not sure modern atheists do believe. I believed that the purpose of life was to make things better. There's kind of a quote of Gorky. And that was partly my social consciousness talking, but that human beings were special, which was the old humanism. Modern atheists, I really don't know, because they've rejected human exceptionalism, many of them, not all of them, and they've rejected the idea of, that humans have the power to make things better. So in some cases, I don't think they think life has a meaning. I don't know. I'm not going to speak to them now, because what I used to believe 50 odd years ago is probably not relevant.
Fair enough. Here's the next question, and this one is a super chat. Thank you, Leon. He says, how did Sy deal with church bullying or cliques?
I've been very lucky. I never saw it. And I not only in my own church, but I've been to many churches, Catholic churches, Baptist, Presbyterian. I never saw anything negative. Maybe I'm just lucky. I've heard horror stories from people, but I have not experienced it.
Here's a question. One of your objections to Christianity was that Christians were hypocritical?
No, I didn't. I didn't know enough Christians to know that. It's funny because so many people have gone the other way. Paul Oja, who I just did a discussion with, is an example of and Matt Dillahunty, and many of the most famous atheists were Christians, and they went the other way. And in many cases, it was because of some of these negative things about Christians. And I'm lucky. I never experienced any of that.
Wow.
Just the opposite.
All right, here's the next question from Nelson Galvan. As scientists discover more facts about the universe, are scientists finding the universe more and more complex instead of simple?
Absolutely. Absolutely. No question about it.
And you talk about that in the book too. So again, here's another plug for the book. Check it out in the description of the video. You definitely want to get your hands on it. His talk on the first part of the book is all about science, and that alone is worth it. From hearing about science from an actual scientist and him breaking it down is really, really awesome. So another plug for the book. What's the title of it? The Works of His Hands.
Correct.
There you go. So there you go. So go check it out if you want to hear more, but that's what you say in the book. Right?
Yes, absolutely. That's one of the themes of the book, and there's no question that this is true.
Yeah. So what are some of the things that you talk about in the book that make it more complex?
Well, one of the chapters is called Science Surprises, and one of the things that you find out very quickly is that when you're a scientist and you're trying to get answers, the answers are almost always surprising. You never expect them. And what they also do is they also always raise more questions. And that was something that, really troubled me. Why should that be true? Why don't we just finish something, anything, any field of science? Let's say, okay, this is done, we're finished, put it to bed. Now, that almost happened at the end of the 19th century, and when physicists thought there was nothing left really to discover except the last few decimal points and some constants. And then Einstein came around in 1905 and ruined all of that with his theory of relativity. So, and it's never changed. So the more we learn, the more we find we still have more to learn. And that's true in every field. In biology, it's just incredible.
Yeah, it almost sounds like, thinking back to this whole idea of fractals, that sounds pretty complex to me too.
Exactly.
That when you get more and more, when you zoom in, it's like the same level of complexity. We're not getting simpler.
There is I don't know, I don't have the link, but there is a YouTube or a video somewhere that shows you the camera actually goes into a fractal, and you can actually see thousands of layers of complexity just emerging from this mathematical equation, which is basically what a fractal is. And if you can look for that, if you search for fractal video, you'll find it, and it's fascinating.
All right, here's the next question from Christopher Bustin. Is the origin of the universe a scientific question or theological? That looks like what he's trying to say. Or a theological question.
Well, I think it's theological. I mean, I don't believe that we'll ever get past the Planck time, 10 to the minus 46 seconds, because there's no way to do it. We don't have physics before that time. So we're not going to know the real origin of the universe scientifically, despite books by Lawrence Krauss and others about, universe from nothing, which is just a misnomer. So I think it's a theological issue at this point, and it's been solved theologically. God created the universe. We're done. It's not much else to say there.
That's interesting. All right, here's another question from David Sanchez. Since your conversion to Christianity was mostly experiential, what are your thoughts on apologetic arguments for Christianity, like the historical argument for the resurrection?
Oh, I love them, and I didn't get to learn them until later. But all of those arguments for the historicity of the resurrection and the existence of Jesus, I find incredibly strong and convincing. And so, your work and Lee Strobel and J. Warner Wallace and Mike Licona and on and on and on. I mean, all these great apologists. I find those arguments absolutely convincing and fascinating.
Awesome. This next one is from Spartan Theology. He also gave a super chat earlier saying that he was so happy to see you on. He said, what view of evolution do you hold to? Process structuralism, neodarwinism, etc. What's your view of evolution?
That's interesting. I think he asked me this on Twitter because it looks familiar. So if I had to characterize it, I would say I think the extended evolutionary synthesis is extremely convincing and interesting. Evolution is no longer Darwinism or even neo-Darwinism. It's gone way beyond that. It's a very complex theoretical construct at this point with a lot of strong evidence in various fields. But I think the exciting work being done in complex mutations and niche construction. I have a paper on that in a Christian journal put out by the ASA. It's called Proceedings in Science and Christian Faith. And I have a paper on that extended evolutionary synthesis. And there are many other papers. There's a book called Evolution 2.0 by a friend of mine, Perry Marshall, which talks about that in some length. So it's worth looking into.
Great. All right. We have one more question, and this one is from Finding Truth. What does Sy think of irreducible complexity?
So it sounds good. And I believe.
Feel free to go as deep into this as you want, because I've actually never talked about this on my show before.
Okay, well, it's an interesting issue, and the question is, does it ever exist or does it never exist? And I believe it sometimes is real. Sometimes it's not. We know some of the cases that were first used as evidence for intelligent design. It turned out that the irreducible complexity was in fact reducible, and that includes things like the flagella and the eye. And the way that's explained is that there were other components that were used, readapted by evolution to fit into complex structures. But there are cases, and one case in particular, which actually relates more to abiogenesis than to evolution, where you have to admit that is irreducible complexity. And even a very famous evolutionary scientist named Eugene Koonin, who is an atheist, has remarked in one of his papers that there's one part of the origin of life that really does appear to be irreducibly complex, and that is the origin of the protein synthesis system, which is an extremely complicated system. We understand it very well. It involves DNA, several kinds of RNA, and it's a remarkable. It's where the genetic code comes from, and I'm going to definitely have a video on that shortly. And that system is required for evolution, and let me explain why if I have a minute. It's required for evolution because the way evolution works is that the environment produces natural selection based on the characteristics of an organism, like a cell or a larger organism. And those characteristics are determined by its proteins, but the proteins cannot replicate themselves. The only thing that can replicate in a cell is the DNA. And the DNA has the information to instruct the cell what proteins to make. So there has to be a very close linkage between the DNA, the genotype, and the characteristics of the cell, which is the phenotype, because the second part is the target of selection. So that system cannot evolve because that system is required for evolution. As far as we know, at least it's required for biological evolution. So that's where I would say that system is irreducibly complex. Now, there are other ways you could get the origin of life without having biological evolution, and people have proposed different kinds of chemical evolution, but that is still, I would say, very unsubstantiated. There's no real good theory for that. It's not enough to say that, oh yeah, the DNA that replicates itself the best survives, and that's natural selection. That's not how it works. That's an oversimplification of the process. So I believe that irreducible complexity occurs there. I don't know how to get around it. That's just unknown. And there may be some other places as well where there are examples, scattered throughout the evolutionary process where it may in fact occur. But it's not sufficient to deny the existence of evolution. Let's put it that way.
All right. Well, I just wanted to say thank you so much for coming on to Capturing Christianity. This has been a real pleasure, and maybe we should do something else. I mean, because I don't just do interviews, I don't just post videos. I host discussions sometimes between Christians and non-Christians. So that might be something that we can do together. Okay. But is there anything else that you'd like to leave the audience with before we sign out today?
No, I think I've said pretty much everything. Again, if there's one take-home message I would like to hit again, it's there is no conflict between real, true, mainstream science and the Christian faith. So if you keep that in your mind, all will be well.
All will be well. And make sure to pick up his book, The Works of His Hands. Again, linked in the description of this video. So until next time, we'll see you guys later.